A few weeks ago, I went to a Tai Chi festival in Northwest New Jersey. There were a lot of things I enjoyed about it. When I got there, it had been raining a lot. It was still raining, lightly. The ground was really soggy. And I brought a tent to camp out because the Tai Chi festival was at a Tai Chi park, a farm, a nice rural house. Beautiful. But I didn't like the idea of being wet and damp. And there was an old barn there that I noticed had an attic, and like a lot of attics, it was filled with lots of stuff, but not totally packed. So I just went up there and I opened the doors and I swept the floor, and that's where I stayed while I was at the Tai Chi festival. A lot of Tai Chi is about being grounded. And being grounded is a term that's used a lot. It can mean all sorts of things. With what's been going on in my life lately, I would give the definition of being grounded is being able to feel the earth underneath you, so your relationship of your feet with the earth, but also allowing the earth to come up into you, which makes a lot of sense if you do Tai Chi or Qigong. Maybe if you do yoga, depending on what kind of yoga you do, and maybe just if you're the kind of person that knows what I'm talking about. But there's let's say on a scientific level, you can always say on a scientific level, that kind of helps certain people. It sounds like the universal religion, though it is not. I want this to sound good. I don't want my beard to rustle on the microphone all the time. Maybe that's better, maybe that's worse. So, one more, a little bit, maybe better, worse, I'm sorry. So there's, on a scientific level, there's gravity, which is always pulling you down. Something you take for granted, you don't pay attention to because you've always been experiencing it. So how would you notice it unless you paid attention noticing it? One aspect of feeling the earth up in your body could be being aware of gravity. And that is to say that there's millions of muscle cells in our body, lots of muscle groups that make what we call muscle bodies, muscle bellies. But each cell itself is doing this pulling, releasing thing. That's how the muscles work. So on a certain level, you can, on a micro level, relax your muscles to feel the gravity, to get the perfect kind of tension balance between the pulling down and the standing up. All of us, unless we're laying down and asleep, usually have some kind of muscle tension holding us up in a certain position. And you can do it while you're awake too. It's not completely relaxing. It's not about completely relaxing, but it's about actually being in the right balance of feeling the precise tension required to stay upright while being as relaxed as possible. That's one way to be aware of gravity. To be able to release all the muscles in every part of the body, feeling and pulling. You can make a whole exercise out of this and do it for hours, years. Another scientific way you can think about it is because the Earth has this magma core that's lots of molten iron and lots of other minerals and elements. There's a radiation, and part of the radiation is magnetic, electromagnetic. So again, because you're experiencing it all the time, it's white noise, you're not noticing it, but if you make yourself aware of it, you can feel it coming up into the body. So there's a permeation, not just of the gravity, but of the electromagnetic radiation from the Earth. So being aware of that is one way of being aware of the relationship with the Earth at all times. So I think it was the second day that I was at this Tai Chi festival, so I had been doing 6 hours of Qigong and Tai Chi a day, not to mention my own little bits that I do on myself, or with myself, and then playing with other people who were teaching and studying there, which was the best part about it, really. There were teachers teaching things, but then at every moment between teaching things, there were people who just wanted to play with energy and awareness, and that just was so great. So I think it was the second day. I was up in the barn, and the barn had a big barn door, like a hay door that you'd throw the hay out or load the hay in from once upon a time. And there was no guardrail, so the door was open just to let the air move through the attic-y dankness. And I got really close to the edge so that my toes were going over the edge of the hayloft, and I felt in my relationship with my body that I was not at all afraid of falling out of the door. It's not something that I do, just lurch forward all of a sudden into the abyss. Though we all tend to have an inbuilt fear that if we're holding a phone over a guardrail, over a bridge, over a building, that we might drop it. Though we don't usually just drop our phone when we're holding it. You know, that's an example. Like if you're walking on a bridge, you might feel like you're afraid you're going to fall off of it, when you don't usually just topple over. I mean, how many times do you just topple over? So anyway, it was a weird sensation that I came to the edge of the door, and I don't remember what I was doing. I was looking out or hanging something on a nail, but I felt a strange sensation of like a gripping in my feet, a painful biting, clenching in my feet. Not a cramp. It wasn't just like a regular cramp. Because a cramp is like all the muscles going, and that's really painful. But it was as if the pain of a cramp without the contraction of the muscle, without the bunching of the muscle. It was a very strange pain. And I was like, what is that? And just a moment of being aware of it, I was aware that it was my body telling me it was afraid of falling, that it was in danger. And I've never been someone with a fear of heights, and although I may have a fear of heights, I was just saying this to somebody recently, that the way most of my life I've responded to fear is just being aware of it and then doing it anyway. So not exactly ignoring it, but being like, oh, okay, yeah, message received, I don't really care. So that's kind of ignoring. It's kind of aware. It's not obviously been the safest of living styles, but it's what I've done. So it was interesting because I'd never felt this sensation before. And then it happened somewhere else. I don't remember where it happened. It happened somewhere else to a lesser degree. And just a few days ago, I was walking through the forest on my way to Bagby Hot Springs. And there were a lot of trees fallen down in the forest, huge old trees, gigantic, big, big, big. And a lot of them were just laying on the ground, and so I would see them and I would run across on them because I love the feeling of running on trees. And I did this 3 or 4 times, and then I saw a tree falling that had fallen over the river. And I was like, oh, I love that. That looks so fun. And I've walked on big trees that have fallen over chasms before. In Tennessee, there was one the first time I ever went to Short Mountain, there was a huge windstorm on Beltane the day I met Goat, and it blew down a whole bunch of trees, it didn't blow down trees then. It was like a week later. There were all these tornadoes that swept through, and it knocked down tons of trees. So the next time I went back to Short Mountain, which was just 2 weeks later, because then I had gone and stayed with Robert in Montgomery for a little while. Yes, the same Robert who just died. I went back and there were all these trees over this chasm. And so I used to hang out on trees over chasms all the time. But when I was walking just a couple days ago on this tree, I started feeling that weird feeling in my feet, this painful clenching, fear of heights, fear in my feet. I was feeling fear in my feet. My feet were afraid I was going to get hurt and fall. And I felt the movement of the tree, the gentle bouncing of a tree. And I was looking at the tree intently, so intently that when I stopped moving, everything was going whoo, whoo, and I was like, oh man, and I started getting vertigo, and I was like, fuck. And I was trying to take a picture of the river over the chasm, and I don't know, I was probably less than 20 feet above the river. It wasn't like I was super high. High enough to get hurt, maybe, but, high enough to get hurt if I fell. Yeah. So I was taking a picture, and then I went to turn around to take a picture of the other way, and I got really dizzy, and I was like, whoa. So I wanted to bring it up just because it's an interesting sensation I've never felt before. And the body changes, of course, throughout time. We notice lots of different changes, some of them for better, some of them for worse. I remember Robert and actually Goat both told me that they could feel the weather changing in their bones, in their joints. And I've heard this from other people, but both of them were very witchy men, or are, one of them still alive. I always felt that was pretty amazing, that wasn't something they were born with, but as they got older and they would get aches and pains in their bodies, then they would be able to really feel like when it was going to rain was like 100% certainty. They didn't need to look at a weather app or watch something on TV. So I guess that was that little story, and 11 minutes. And then I was going to launch into a longer story because when I was walking out to Bagby, I did not get hurt, in case you wonder. There's no rips and scars right now. I did not get hurt. And we walked up to Bagby, and I had not been to Bagby for over a decade, and it was nice to be there. And I was laying in the tub with this fellow I was walking with. Nice fellow. Very pale, white-skinned, strawberry blonde, golden-furred bear from Arkansas. There were a lot of these. Arkansas was where when I lived in Portland in 1999, I left Portland to go live in Arkansas with Robert. He just died a couple weeks ago. So there were lots of these strange little correlations. And I've had this, anyway, I'll leave that out for a minute. So we're up at Bagby, and we're laying in the hot tub, and the bear, really wants all my attention, but he's also aware that he's being considerate and letting me enjoy myself. I have the bike mounted on I have the phone mounted on a bike rack on the back of the bike. Oh, now it's moving. Damn it, I had it precariously balanced, and now I needed my water bottle, and now it's a problem. Oh, so much trouble. Oh, so much trouble. Hi there. Everything's fine. So we're laying in the hot water, and this idea comes into my head. I wonder if the spirit that I met at Bagby is still here. And I guess, at least the way I've experienced reality, is that when you ask a question, the universe tries to answer it for you, or your body perhaps comes into a receptive mode so that it can know the answer. My body comes into a receptive mode so that it can know the answer. My mind becomes curious and perceptive so that it might know the answer whenever a question is asked. And I guess when trying to be aware of spirits, one becomes potentially aware of a softer dimension, a different perception. So I'm laying there in the water, and I think this bear is holding my head, sitting behind me with his back against the wall, or the end of the tub. The tubs at Bagby are these really big trees that they've just been hollowed out into tubs. Somebody was using a KFC container to plug up the hole. Plastic. Imperfect world. So I become soft and perceptive, listening. I wonder if the spirit that I met at Bagby is still here. And as often happens when I'm with people and I start drifting into another dimension, he says, "Hey, are you thinking about something right now? Can you tell me what you're thinking about? Some way to pull me back into this one." Being grounded also means that. Being grounded in this reality. Being aware of the earth, being grounded in your body, in yourself, in this reality. I suppose if you're grounded in some other dimension, then you're not really grounded here. And other people are like, "Hey, what's going on?" So he felt that, and he asked something. And so I started telling him the story. And I've told this story a lot before, but have you heard it? So I had to tell the story to him. And it goes something like this. When I was living in Portland in 1999, I had been doing acid and mushrooms somewhat regularly for a few years. I'd probably just turned 21 around this time, and I'd first done acid when I was 15, but didn't do it again until I was 18. Oh no, I did 15 and 15 was not really acid. 16 was the first time I really did acid, and then I didn't do it again until I was 18. And it seemed to me I was doing it a lot, but I wasn't doing it as much as most. I had a good friend who started doing it every day in high school, and we stopped being friends, and he really got into the Grateful Dead and lots of other stuff and smoked pot all the time, and he stayed in Indiana, eventually shot himself. So I don't know, I think that all levels of inebriation, if done regularly, are dangerous and poisonous. I've been having contention with inebriation lately. Or forever. But anyway, I had been taking acid somewhat regularly, and that might be like 4 or 5 times a year. Not every day, not every weekend, for, what would that be, 3 years. Yeah. Acid or mushrooms, and it was interesting, and I was working with different drugs, but not only drugs, but trying to get into different dimensions of reality through meditation and conversation, which conversation to me was like drugs, like meditation. Like having good people to have conversations with is a multidimensional experience that you can open up levels of reality. There's actually, I was happy to discover this last year, that there's a whole strata of Indian philosophy that is about the creation, perception, understanding of reality through discourse, which I think is really great. And of course, Rumi talks about constant conversation, and the constant conversation that was part of his spiritual practice. But I digress. So I've been doing acid mushrooms regularly, and me and 2 friends, one of whose brother had recently committed suicide. I think we were going up to Bagby at the anniversary of the year, of the anniversary, the first anniversary of his brother committing suicide, his older brother. And then just one of my friends who I was very good friends with, that I had, she kind of had been the one who brought me up to Oregon, and I had kind of known her since I was 2, though we weren't really close friends until I was 14 or 15 or something, but we'd known each other our whole childhood. And so we went up to the hot springs together, these 3, and we had taken mushrooms, and we got the private tub. So Bagby, when I was up there recently, I was with this guy in one of the couples tubs, big log hollowed out. But there's also big community tubs, and there's ones you have to wear clothes at, which there's like 3 or 4 of them right next to each other, and then there's a big one that's kind of off by itself, and you don't have to wear clothes there if you don't want. It's private. So we were in that one, and we'd been there for a while, and I remember at that one you could turn the hot water, I think, comes out of the ground there at about 180 degrees or something. It's very hot. And there's a cold spring up there as well. So this specific private tub has cold water and hot water piped into it. And like always, when you're making a bath, you have to work for a while adjusting the temperature. Like how hot do you want it to be, how cold do you want it to be. And we'd been enjoying ourselves there. Nothing too detailed to talk about there. But as the trip was coming on, like as the peak was hitting, we got more quiet, and the boy whose brother had committed suicide decided that he was going to go off into the woods to do some ritual. Because he's a very ritual-oriented person. He was going to go off into the woods to do some ritual by himself. And so he kind of walked off. And the girl, I always loved the way she talked. She said something like, "I'm going to put on my warm skins," meaning clothes. Because we were up there in the winter, I think. Or spring, early spring. So maybe I hadn't turned 21 yet. Maybe I was still 20. Might have been March. I don't remember. But she walked off to go have an adventure in the forest, just to interact with the forest, and I just laid there in the tub. And I had been working at a gay bathhouse in Portland at the time, and having a lot of sex. And I think I had recently tested positive for some kind of non-specific urethral infection, which is the first time I'd had that, or anything like that. And I was really concerned. I have Virgo rising, so anything imperfect really bothers me. And the first time it happens when you're young, or the first time it happens at any age, it really bothers you because you've never experienced it before. But I was young, and it was the first time it happened that I'd had something like that, and I was really worried. And so I was laying in the water, feeling whatever kind of disturbance I had in my urethra. Feeling what that felt like. What does that feel like? And I did a lot of healing work on myself in those days. I was really into Reiki. This boy who was there with me, he had given me my first Reiki attunement. I'd been doing intuitive energy work for a long time. I was really concerned with health. And so similarly to the story I was telling earlier, I asked my body what I could do to heal whatever damage I had done to my urethra, even though I'd taken antibiotics. I felt like damage had been done and I had to somehow fix it, perfect it. And when I asked for help, some dimension shifted. I became sensitive and aware of a spirit that was there to help me. And the spirit was sitting on the edge of the tub and looked a lot like this kid whose name was Nick, which is nice because my name was Nick when I was a couple of years as a teenager. I was Nicky most of my childhood, and then Nick for a few years because somebody made fun of me for being a little girl. And I'm not a little girl, but I was only Nick for 2 years because I didn't really like it, and then I just took on Dominic, which was my birth name. And messages come through, and I have to swipe them away. The spirit appeared sitting on the edge of the hot tub. They looked like Nick, and Nick was a very tall, skinny man who was a Libra. This is important for the story. Tall, skinny man with long red hair that dropped in like waves. Kind of wavy like my hair is now. Portland really, the Pacific Northwest really makes waves, but his hair was even wavier and it was shiny. He took a lot more care of his hair. I think he had been like a hairdresser for a while. I don't remember, but I met him at the bathhouse where I worked. He had been my fairy godmother. But it was very clear to me at the hot spring that it wasn't Nick. It was the spirit that was using Nick. And one of the reasons it used Nick, because Nick was a Libra, Nick was able to carry the energy of a hermaphrodite or the divine androgyne. I don't know if Nick... I haven't seen Nick in a long time, and Nick's changed Nick's name a few times, and I don't know if Nick would have called themselves a trans person. But the spirit was definitely a trans spirit. Although I did, and when I tell the story, I often refer to it as a girl, as a she. But that's why it was able to use Nick, and it was and knew that Nick was comfortable to me. But it didn't. It looked like Nick in that, it had this beautiful smile, skinny, bony Nick's face, and the long, beautiful, wavy, curly hair. but had huge antlers coming out of her head. Now, the times that I've done mushrooms and acid, it's very rare that I ever have hallucinations like this. So it has, I mean, it does, but a lot of people, when they hallucinate, they, whatever, see dancing bears or skeletons or Grateful Dead bullshit. I occasionally see fairies and spirits. So this is the first, and, well, I don't know if it's the only time, but it's definitely one of the first times that it manifested as a person I knew, but I knew it wasn't that person. And she just kind of guided me through some stuff. And it led into, I know that I felt like I wanted more heat in the water, so I turned off the cold water. Just so that the hot water could get hotter. And she and I think I closed my eyes and we went into the world inside of myself. And she and I started examining what it meant to be damaged and what it meant to be sick. And again, this was 1999. I was born in 1978. I came out as gay to myself when I was 13, 14. Which was the early 90s. If you remember, what it meant to be gay in the early 90s was you're going to get AIDS and die. So I had lived my whole life with HIV. A doctor had actually told me, well, that's another story. It's another HIV, AIDS, acid story that I had. Well, I'll just tell it really quickly instead of in depth. But I was sick all the time as a teenager and got... my mother at one point in time was taking me all these different doctors, and at one point in time took me to get blood work, or sent me to get blood work, and then I went and got the results by myself because I was driving, so I was 16 at the time, yeah. And the doctor was like, "Do you know what AIDS is? We would say you have AIDS because you have 70 T cells." And I was like, 70? He was like, 70. He's like, "Your body's just filled with bacteria and viruses, and you're very sick, and we don't know what's going on because you don't have HIV, which is what we think causes AIDS, but we're not sure. So we don't really know what to do to solve this. We could give you a bunch of stuff to kill the bacteria and viruses in your system." And I was like, "No thanks." And then a couple weeks later, or maybe a month or something, I took acid at a party and I stopped being sick because these spirits came out of the forest and told me how to not be sick anymore. So maybe this is kind of a connection with that. This is like, we're in the hot tub in Bagby. The spirit and I are inside of myself and we're examining what it means to be sick, and I find this whole HIV problem. It's such a problem. You can't just be free and have sex. You're going to die. We're living with HIV, all of us. That was part of the rhetoric at the time, was that, we all have HIV, we all have AIDS. I think that was more, the rhetoric was we all have AIDS. Maybe it was we all have HIV. But I really was taking that to heart because, again, I have a messiah complex, which I was unaware of at the time. So it was just happening as opposed to me being aware, oh, that's a messiah complex. What does that mean, a messiah complex? It means that through myself, I've often wondered if I could save the entire world. What does that mean? Through the thoughts, feelings, actions of myself, somehow cure the world of hatred and abuse and exploitation and death. Save me from death. Save you from death. Anyway, She and I were going through the problem with AIDS. And I guess how I remember now, we got there because I was trying to heal the wound in my urethra by finding the culprit, the pathology, and somehow expelling it. But believing that all is one, which I had already come to this understanding at this age, and certainly it was heightened on mushrooms, I was like, how do you get rid of something when everything is me, when everything is one, when there is no other? How do you get rid of something? There is no out there. And she explained to me that there had been, for a long time, before a certain paradigm shift happened, there had been an outside and an inside in the dualities. But part of the magic that I had gained by understanding the one of unity meant that I lost the convenience and magic of duality. There was no other. There was nothing but self. And she then explained to me that this was actually the problem with AIDS, was that in order to get rid of something, you have to kill something, you have to die and be reborn again. It's all self. So the self has to die and be reborn again, and then you can be free of the problem, the wound, the imperfection, be born again, be fresh and clean. And death had been an other in the realm with the duality, and that if you crossed into death, then you were free, released. But in the connection of unity, and again, this probably happened 5,000 years ago, in the connection of unity, when you died, you just came back again with all the same stuff. And somewhere along the line, an incurable, unhealable reason for death of everything got tied into the birth, the solution. I guess that was because it was all part of unity. There was a really good reason to die, a really good reason to end the story, to flush the toilet, to let go of everything. I don't know if this is communicating. I think I just made some jumps. Somewhere along the line, there was some illness, some wound, incurable, kind of like a Chiron story, if that makes any sense to you, that the death would not heal. So very similar to, reincarnation. Like, you don't get over your wounds through dying. You have to live them out somehow, find other solutions. I don't know, but she'd explained that that was part of what AIDS was that you couldn't get rid of it by dying. That death had somehow been connected into life. Oh, that's what started AIDS, was that you had death had been connected into life as a motivation, as a solution, as a reason. So at this time in my life, I was really obsessed with the idea of resetting the whole life story, God, kind of eradicating God and letting the whole universe start over again, so that all these stories would stop. Because I just saw I was only focusing on misery and exploitation and abuse and fear, and I was a very sad youth. So at one point in time, I sunk underneath the surface of the water. She's explaining these things to me, and I kind of breathed out my air and just sunk under the water. I know that this actually happened. I do not remember how long I was under the water. While I was under the water, she'd explained this thing about AIDS to me, and I was really confused and sad and frustrated by it. And again, was just trying to figure out health. How do I be healthy? This guy that I was up there with at Bagby last week, he asked me at one point, he was like, "Are you healthy?" And I was like, are you asking me if I have HIV? And he was like, yeah. And then after I told him, he was like, well, are you healthy? I was like, well, physically I'm healthy, but I'm not really emotionally and psychically and healthy because I don't feel like my life's sustainable, and I don't, know how to have the things I want, and I don't even know if I know what I want. This is all like scattering all of a sudden. The new Arcade Fire album has this song called Creature Comforts in it, where there's this like repetitious refrain of like, on and on, I don't know what I want. On and on, I don't know if I want it. On and on, I don't know what I want. On and on, I don't know if I want it. And of course, there's a lot of pop music that references that kind of thing. Like, I don't know what to want from this world. I don't know what it is you want to want from me. I've always had that problem. Anyway, so I don't know if I'm healthy because I don't know. Like, I don't feel like I have a holistic understanding of happiness with everything. So I was trying to figure out how to get healthy with this spirit. And I'm underwater. And we're going through, like, because she knows the answers to everything. I need all my questions. So I was like, so how do we... And she was like, oh, well, this is connected to this. And I was like, how do I get rid of this unhappiness? How do I get rid of this frustration? How do I get rid of this confusion? How do I get rid of this constant bother? And she was like, well, that's connected to your relationship with your father, and that's connected to your relationship with your mother, and that's connected to some... And basically I was seeing these strings that kind of went infinitely in each direction that connected into some story. And I was at the center where there was a knot. And that's what made me up, was this huge cluster of knots that stretched out into infinity. At this moment in time, there was a knot, and that was me. But like thousands of knots. And so I was like noticing, like she would help me untie these knots, and as soon as one was released, I would notice other ones, and I'd be like, oh, but then there's this frustration, there's this problem, there's this confusion. And she was like, yeah. See, I'm not the kind of person that it's fun to do acid with, because this is what I tend to be doing. I'm always talking to God and trying to sort out the universe. So we're going through all of my tangles with reality and untying all these knots, and I'm getting really excited. And we get to the point where there's only one knot left, and I'm like, great, let's do it. She's like, wait. You have to understand that if you untie this knot, then Dominic's going to die. And I'm like, that's fine, let's go. And she's like, but that means that the body in this hot tub will be here, dead. And one of your friends, his brother just committed suicide a year ago, and he's going to come back here, and he's going to be really traumatized by finding his friend dead. And your other friend, she's known you since you were 2, and she's going to be pretty traumatized by finding you dead. And I was like, oh. Yeah, it's kind of a shitty thing to do. She's like, yeah, and not only that, but then the hot springs will be shut down because some guy died in them, and they'll reopen, but they'll be shut down for a while. People won't be able to come here, and they'll probably have to change laws. And I was like, yeah, that's kind of a bummer. She's like, yeah, it's kind of like like leaving a gigantic shit in a toilet in a public place. And I was like, yeah, I get it. She's like, so you're not going to die then? I'm like, no, this is not really a convenient place to do that. She's like, then you better stand up and take a breath. And I realized that I would been like at the bottom of the hot tub in really hot water for I don't know how long. And I put my feet down and I stood up and I was like, and I stood up for a while, and then I collapsed back into the water. And when I collapsed back into the water, because I was so pure, I was so released, that I was one with everything. And when I told this story recently, it's interesting. It's at the time, I think I experienced it as if I were the center of the universe because I had a solipsistic problem, but I don't think that anymore. So when I told it recently, I had this realization that I was just one with everything, so everything was speaking through me as it was expressing itself. And as I lay in the water, like the wind in the trees were perfectly synced with sensations and feelings and understandings. The light, the beams of light coming through the trees. A chipmunk and a bird landed on the branches above me and were making noises that totally were expressing thoughts in my head, or thoughts in my head were mimicking the forest's expression of being. Being. More than itself. Being. No self. One. Unity. It was just totally blissful. Until my friends got back. And they both came back at the same time. They had probably met up previously. I've never really asked them. So self-centered. They came back and they found me, and I was so excited. I stood up out of the water and just started trying to tell them everything that had just happened. And I was talking 1,000 miles a minute, and when I got to the point that I was like, and then I got to the point where I almost died, and then I stood up because you go, oh, now you guys are back so I can die. And they were like, what? And the boy, who is a total wizard, was like, no, don't die right now. And pretty much all the times I'd done mushrooms and acid, I'd come up against some death thing. And because I could tell it was fear, this is how it connects to the fear in my feet story. Because I could tell it was fear that was keeping me from dying, I wanted to die so that I could just get past the fear. I did not like being held back, constricted, constrained by fear. I was like, okay, if I can just die, then I'll be fine. Because then I'm free. I'm free of this fear. That's what it means to be free, right? It's to not have any fears holding you back. And death is the big fear. So I'd kept pushing up against death and be like, I'd get scared and scary. But my friends were back, and I had just untied all these knots, and I was one with the universe, and I was like, great, look, I can die right now. And he was like, no! And I just fell down on the ground and passed out. Because I felt like I was intrinsically intimate with life at that moment. That it was the easiest thing to just let go. And I did. I woke up X amount of time later in a little cabin where the caretakers of the hot springs were resuscitating me with Gatorade or an emergency or something. And I came to drinking water through a straw, the electrolyte broth through a straw. And I blinked and I looked around, and the boy and the girl that I was there with, looked at me. And as soon as they saw that consciousness was back in my eyes, they got up and they went outside. And the two caretakers were looking at me, and I just looked at them, and I spat the straw out of my mouth, and I said, I would rather be dead than be a part of your world. They're like, great, just keep drinking. You're fine. I don't remember. It'd be so interesting if I had my friends tell their story of that day. It might not be a big deal for them. It was very exciting for me. Because it cut a week later, the roommate that I was living with at the time, Tapestry Ashton, who later died of AIDS because he wouldn't take medication. Tapestry had, or maybe it was the same boy. We were in my apartment with Tapestry, and I think one of my friends, maybe the boy I'd just gone to the hot spring with, had DMT, had gotten DMT, and we all smoked DMT together. And when I smoked it, because I had never done it before, the first inhale I took, so you only take one hit off of it, but as I started to inhale, it tasted a bit like burnt plastic, kind of like meth tastes. Like burnt plastic, like burnt electrical wires. And my purity and my self and my protective self was like, oh, you shouldn't do this. This is going to hurt you. And I was just like, shut up. I don't have to worry about hurting myself. It was just a... And I kept inhaling it, and the whole self shattered and disappeared. And I was able to just let it go, just a sigh, the easiest, like that. Just let it go. Fall over. Boom. Fall down right there. Crack. And, I just made a Richard reference. All the things from the past come back when you start referencing it. When you are there and you start referencing it, all the memories, and it's so funny. Richard, the poet. Fall down right there. So I was gone for, I think, about 10 minutes in reality time. Infinite amount of time, non-existing. And then the idea of me came back into existence in this gigantic infinite black void. And the idea of me called forth blue sparks to reform itself. And each of the sparks, as it flew from limitless infinity into whatever the self was, and formed this big ball of sparks that reformed myself and my entire relationship to the universe, was an awareness of all of my understandings and agreements of self with this reality structure. I was able to understand it all as it was recoalescing, and as my body and mind and self reformed, I just stood up and was laughing my ass off. It was super fun. Yay, DMT. When you're 20 years old in Portland, Oregon, whatever Portland is, whatever 20 years old is, whatever acid and mushrooms and DMT is, whatever fear is, whatever life is, what to do with the happiness and wanting, the longing, the stuff collecting,